communism because Marx's critiques of capitalism are still relevant. And so as a critique of capitalism, which are the kinds of critiques of capitalism that everyone kind of agrees, yeah, that's a problem with capital. That's the way it works. The rich get richer and the poor get worse off. The only thing that could actually help that would really be changes in the law that make a country more socialist. Because naturally, the rich use their wealth in order to get wealthier. And they're not that interested in helping other people unless there's something in the government that forces it. We live in a society that, as I said, is kind of socialistic since 1938, when FDR led a liberal movement to create governmental programs that enabled people to have support from the government. And of course, where does the government get the money that it uses to support people? From the rich people. Taxes. And they were unbelievably high when I was a kid. It's amazing how much tax wealthy people paid at the end of World War II and so on, the Eisenhower administration. I was born when President Truman was still president, but Eisenhower was next. And there were lots of social programs, the programs like Social Security, which is a Ponzi scheme, actually.
Is it really?
Well, where does the money come from? The people that are paying into Social Security now,
Because it's not there yet.
they don't receive it yet. I've been getting Social Security since I was 66. It's one of the three legs on my stool. My military retirement, my Social Security. Donna gets Social Security too. And then I'm still actually getting paid by people like you to come and listen to me prattle on, bore you guys to death. Thank you, by the way. So I have a three-legged stool myself. The three-legged stool metaphor is applied often to the state of Alaska. Oil money, government money, and everything else. The three-legged stool.
Do you think that, the government is kind of like forced sharing? And when I will make my kids share, they don't want to share, but when they decide to share, they really enjoy sharing. And they would share more without, if I don't request them to do it, than if I force them to do it.
Well, you're hitting at like the basic division, really, in human nature. Yes, we do love sharing, but within usually particular social groups. Mice do this. They've studied mice, and mice will treat mice that are, part of their family, right? Genetically closer mice. And they've measured this out something like 10 or 20 different degrees of difference. So mice will treat mice that are closer to them genetically nicer and nicer, less nice, less nice, less nice, and attack them. So there's a biological, I mean, if you think about it, it's not that the genes are selfish genes, as it's ridiculous to think genes have any kind of personality at all, but they seem mechanically driven by the need to reproduce, right? And, if I feel like my nieces and nephews are much more important to me than some strange child, right? I can see them. I can see their faces and recognize my mother. I mean, there's a biological similarity there that as they say, blood is thicker than water. And so societies naturally will share among groups. The trouble that we've had, of course, is when you get to a kind of liberal view that other people that don't even look like us, and I mean they don't even wear the same clothing, they eat different food, they smell weird. I remember being on the bus in Berlin, because my window on my Volvo station wagon was shot out twice, actually. So I ended up having to do this twice. And that was to take the car to the one place in North Berlin that could replace the Volvo windshield, you know. The other time it was a back window, so it was a lot cheaper. But in any case, I had to drive it there, drop it off, and then take buses back to the south portion of Berlin where I worked and lived. And I remember being on a bus and the windows were closed, by the way, even though it was a hot summer day, because of that was the requirement that the buses have their windows closed because there was a possibility of violence, and no one wanted open windows on the bus because somebody could throw something into the bus or whatever. So I'm standing room only, on this hot bus on a hot summer day, and the person standing in front of me was a woman with her armpits, very hairy armpits, totally not my cultural experience, of course, actually very European, and actually she was Turkish, and my goodness, it almost knocked me over. It was such a strong body odor. Not something I'm familiar with. So yes, there are people that are so radically different, listen to such different music and so on. And you think, how do I, or if they are even different color. By the way, I've grown up initially not even having anyone in our neighborhood that would have been, I mean, we thought of our neighborhood as a mixed neighborhood because we had Polish people across the street, Irish, Italian. We had Italian people on our street. The Pellegrinis were Italian. But we were all Roman Catholic, so it was like, they're different than us. They eat pierogi, whatever the heck that is. But, they're people too. They're Catholics. They go to Mass. They even go to the same school. The kids go to Susan, Kordowski. I mean, she's just like, she's human, just like me. Susan Kordowski. Where do you learn those kinds of words, right? You kind of learn to accept them. When I joined the Army, that was the first time I ended up meeting people who looked different than me in a way that we would refer to as, and it's incorrect, we call it a different race. Whoa, wait a minute, wow. Theoretically, you can still mate within, and Thomas Jefferson's a perfect example, him and his cousin, more children than he had with his official wife, etc. What do we mean by race? It's a social construct. You read that and you think, well, that's because biologists can't find a specific trigger to say these people are in a different race than these people, etc. It's a social construct. They are human. There's one human race. But certainly in society, you grow up depending on whether you're in India, where they have a caste system, etc., right? Those people are untouchable. Ooh, how can you tell? Can't you just see the difference? Not if you're an American, you don't see the difference.
What do you mean? What is a caste system?
Well, actually a new book about that. This is what a caste is, but the relatively recent book. So this is a Hindu differentiation. I think there's 5 different Brahmins. I think are at the top, and so on. And they're not allowed to even. But now this is the new book here that Isabel Wilkerson wrote. And it applies to us, so she takes the idea of a caste and applies it to us. You might be familiar with her because of the more famous book, The Warmth of Other Suns. But when we get back to Marx and this division, who ought you to be concerned about? Peter Singer, if you're familiar with him as one of the philosophers on my list, believes we ought to give rights to animals, and we ought to be vegans and not eat other animals. How we treat other primates, monkeys especially in laboratories and so on, rabbits, how rabbits are treated, where scientists treat them as if they don't really suffer pain, or we don't care whether they suffer pain or not. They ought to be part of our sense of inclusion as well, so that we treat them humanely and so on, not to treat them as animals. Remember, we're animals. So that's the big social division. Although we normally think of the people on the right as being way the heck over, they're philosophically over here, and the people on the left, they're way the heck over here. Remember that most Americans, or most people, are somewhere in the middle. So we don't really have this divide, although who do you help? In my own family, what we traditionally want to do is save our money and then give it to our children so that they have a step up. Do we want to give it away in charities and things? Perhaps, but it's limited because we want to prioritize our own children first. And that seems to be a pretty straightforward American belief. Well, Karl Marx, going to the University of Berlin, he starts off at the University of Vienna. He was fooling around too much, so his father said, go to Berlin. He thought that would fix it. And it didn't, because he just fooled around more in Berlin. But in any case, he, instead of becoming a lawyer, studied philosophy. And influenced by Feuerbach and Stirner and others, where they're all convinced that Hegel's philosophy is the philosophy to follow, but these, the young Hegelians, are going to change it somewhat, and mostly in a way that's going to critique the authorities. Hegel was a moderate. In fact, the reason he was appointed to be the professor in the university in Berlin and the head of the university was because he was known to be a political moderate. And there was a tension in Berlin at the time because Schleiermacher, who was a theologian very popular in Berlin, was a very liberal Lutheran theologian. And the community, of course, especially the nobility, were very conservative. And so they pretty much thought Hegel will be able to kind of mediate between the liberal and the conservative points of view. And he did. He was very successful in bringing the community together. But of course, after his death in 1831, and then Marx, as well as Kierkegaard, ended up studying with Schelling, who I showed, his page, an existence philosophy was his very nature-based, very almost evolutionary-based concept of how important nature was. So Hegel's much more social, involved in how society evolves. Schelling is much more interested in how nature evolves in tune with society. And so along comes Kierkegaard, who's going to listen to this Hegelian system and rebel against it because his focus is more on the self. Marx is going to see it and interpret it as dominatingly the economy, as the main driver of the kind of society and freedoms that people have. So they're still interested in Hegel's concept of freedom as the main goal of history, the end of history. I think I mentioned Francis Fukuyama writing a book called The End of History, and everybody making fun of it because, of course, history hasn't ended. But if you think of it as the goal of history, what's the goal of history? Whoa, entropy. In a scientific sense, maybe everything tends towards the cool, but also society. Historically, it seems like there's this kind of dialectical process between conservative, liberal, conservative, liberal, conservative, liberal,